Good evening, colleagues and students and friends, and welcome. And I think we were just running out of seats there, which is a wonderful testimony to our speaker for tonight. So thank you all for turning out in this sort of number. This evening, as is our tradition, we have the presentation of an inaugural lecture that follows Rhodes University conferring the status of full professor on an academic. This is a very old tradition which we use to celebrate the discipline, the scholarship, and the contributions of a senior professor of the academy. Before coming to Rhodes in 1997, just over 20 years ago, Professor Anthea Garman practiced as a journalism during the state of emergency in the 1980s, through the transition to democracy in the 1990s, working for the Rand Daily Mail, the Cape Times, the Sunday Times, the Natal Witness, where she was the assistant editor, and also for African Enterprise in Pietermaritzburg. Once here, Professor Garman took to academia with substantial relish, both as a teacher and as a researcher, marrying her extensive experience as a journalist with her new role as an academic. She has taught news writing, writing and editing, multimedia storytelling, and print publication skills at all levels of the undergraduate program as well as in the postgraduate program. As a testament to how well she did this, she received the Vice Chancellor's Senior Distinguished Teaching Award in 2011. Teaching is something that resonates very deeply with her, as I'm sure we're going to hear tonight. She was involved in the School of Journalism and Media Studies range of substantial changes to teaching in the curriculum from 1999 to 2003, and she directed this process during 2001. She co-taught the first integrated media studies and production courses, which were part of this major curriculum review. And she was involved in developing and teaching a core course in gender studies for the interdisciplinary arts honors degree at Rhodes University. Between 2007 and 10, Professor Garman was the chair of the Grocot's Male Teaching Forum, a space which was designed to facilitate an effective teaching environment in the newsroom of the university-owned newspaper. In fact, she had been instrumental in this becoming a university-owned newspaper because she drafted the proposal that persuaded Atlantic Philanthropies to provide the funds that enabled the university to purchase this newspaper. Since 2017, Professor Garman has been part of the 4-member team developing a course in multimedia storytelling for the B-Journal students in their final year. She is currently involved in curriculum discussions about how to integrate new media technologies into print teaching as part of the new focus on digital convergence, which is taking place in the school. Professor Garman's research spans the areas of gender, media and citizenship, identity issues in the global South, and the role of media in culture and social change in post-apartheid South Africa. She was awarded her PhD in July 2009 by the University of the Witwatersrand for a thesis around Antjie Krog. She later published her first book on the topic, Antjie Krog and the Post-Apartheid Public Sphere, which has the very lovely subtitle, Speaking Poetry to Power. And this book won her the Rhodes University Vice Chancellor's Book Award in 2015. She has presented at many conferences, written numerous articles, chapters of books, and book reviews, and is well known for her poetry, creative writing, columns, and in fact her own blog, Writing Across Genres. She also holds a National Research Foundation research rating. From 2011 to 2014, she was, along with Professor Herman Wasserman, co-leader of the Mellon-funded focus area, Media and Citizenship between the Marginalization and Participation. This led to a second book, co-authored with Herman, published by HSRC Press on the work emanating from this collaboration. Professor Garman is a member of the current Mellon-funded research project, Media and Sociality, which examines highly digitized post-colonial spaces and their possibilities for social connection. She has been the deputy head of the School of Journalism and Media Studies, responsible for portfolios of research, community engagement in the school since 2014. She is also the editor of the Rhodes Journalism Review, which has become, under her editorship, a very prestigious thought leader and a great profile builder for this university, one that we're very proud of. Tonight, in this inaugural lecture, she will share with us the series of accidents. At least this is what her advert says, but she's always full of surprises. A series of accidents that brought her from her career as a journalist to her career now as a senior professor. So it is my great pleasure to hand over the podium to Professor Garman.
Okay. Right, so here we go. Okay. A series of accidents brought me to this place today, where I get to address those who've become an important part of my life about what my life's work means and adds up to. Many people don't get such an opportunity, but the academic community believes in the values of history and reflection. So such an opportunity is afforded to me. And I count myself fortunate, and as I've said, a little bit terrified to have it. Those accidents, which I will talk about a little more, have meant that I've had a whole career as a journalist before I became an academic. And so I'm a little older perhaps than most professors standing at this same spot. I'm close-ish to the ending of this career, and I intend to have another one as a fully fledged writer before I finish altogether. What I want to talk about tonight are the deep preoccupations of my life, as it's turned out. I didn't start out knowing this, which are the personal and the political, talk and listening, and of course writing. So let me start with the accidental part first. I hope you can see this lovely 91-year-old woman who's meant so much to me. When I was 17 and about to finish school, a conversation took place that I was not party to and did not find out about until about 10 years ago. Because in some families at that time, that was how you treated important conversations about girls. My father announced to his family that he thought I should get a job in a bank as soon as I got my matric. That's what he had done, and he thought it a good route for me because I was good at maths. My mother said nothing, but my step-grandmother, Cynthia, immediately challenged him, saying I should go to university because clearly I had the aptitude for it. He responded that he could not possibly afford the fees. And Cynthia, who is resourceful and doesn't take a no easily, told him he could apply to a bank for a student loan. That's how I found myself at Wits in 1978, studying maths, English, Zulu, and economics with my first bank account and a checkbook. I can't now remember the circumstances of my finding out about this intervention. Perhaps it came through one of those family situations where someone else who's been told the story casually repeats it, and then I hear it for the first time and am struck by the moment in the past, the fork in the road, where I would have been set on an entirely different path. And with hindsight, I can see that that road, which my father thought good enough for me, would have been frustrating, narrowing, and wholly inadequate. Then, when I was in my second year at Wits, I finally got up the courage to tell my mother, my parents were divorced and she was the one I lived with, that I absolutely hated the place. I had no friends and my courses were boring. I told my mother this in the presence of Cynthia. By this point, I'd figured out that in my family, she was the only person who took a girl's aspirations seriously and needed to be present for important conversations. I was studying a mishmash of courses because a guidance counselor had devised that perhaps journalism was a good career for me, and he was giving me options. Cynthia pointed out to my mother that journalism was a good study choice and that I could move to Rhodes. My mother used my father's reason, a shortage of money. And this time, Cynthia did not win the argument. It wasn't the money that was the deciding factor. The bank loan could easily have been extended to another university, another course, and residence fees, it was that as the only child, my leaving would have left my mother alone. Again, the path not taken. Another haunting, which I'm conscious of as I now teach at this institution and pour my energies into the place I never got to. I persevered at Wits. It didn't get much better. I left with a BA. I needed a job, and in the early 80s, it was possible as a white kid to just phone up a newspaper and ask about their training courses. In January of 1981, I was sitting in a classroom with 7 others learning how to become a journalist for the Rand Daily Mail. Then followed years of journalism, which I discovered really was a good choice for me. It gave me direct access to all sorts of people and situations, and taught me how to find information in a vast range of places, and how to interview and ask total strangers impertinent questions. I worked in Johannesburg and Cape Town, and then moved to Pietermaritzburg and to the Witness. This was the mid-80s, and the states of emergency were in effect, as was the civil war between the ANC and Inkatha. Because Pietermaritzburg is a small city, the newspaper had a powerful relationship with the university, and much of the city's communal life, the theatre, public lectures, etc., took place on campus. My journalism and my activism started to be strongly affected by academics and researchers. It started to bother me that journalists around me were very happy with the surface answers to the very complex problems we were reporting on. I began to lean on researchers as my sources and to wish for a different kind of journalism. That frustration took me back to university. By this time, married to an academic, I was allowed to study free as a spouse, and I returned for an honours degree and then a master's. That made journalism harder and harder for me, but it was the path taken, the path I chose to set my feet upon and walk. The next choice I made was to answer the job advert for a position in the Department of Journalism and Media Studies at Rhodes, to teach journalism. It took a while, maybe a long while, for me to transition out of that very deep socialization as a journalist and to open up the possibility for myself that perhaps, after all, what I really wanted to be was an intellectual, working with ideas, learning, teaching, researching, thinking, and reading, and doing this in a community that valued these things. I've always done these things in some way, but I needed the skills and I needed the access. So the next choice was a PhD, back at Wits, of all places. Okay. So that's the accidental part. But hidden within it are the preoccupations, fascinations, and deep interests that continue to drive me in what I do in the world. So now we get to the profession part. In my school, those of us who are practice teachers argue a lot about what professional means. Because we intend our students to get jobs in the media, we are preoccupied with the skills and abilities they require to persuade employers that they are professionally trained, or as a former colleague of mine has termed it, they are fit for purpose. For a long time, I avoided these arguments because the language seemed reductionist and mechanistic. I found other ways to express what qualities I thought they should acquire, and I found Bobby Zellers's language of journalists operating as interpreters and working within an interpretive community very persuasive. But more recently, I've returned to the idea of profession and begun to think of it in the cast of, what do I profess? And here is where the word profession has a religious root and runs into its fellow word, confession. As in, what do I believe? What do I adhere to? What values are guiding my purpose in the world? And maybe even further and more darkly, what am I willing to fail at, or lose for, or even die for? I went down this route when I became an associate professor because it seemed to me that I really should sort this out if I was to carry the identity of professor in training. I've come to love this wordplay, to ask myself, what do I profess as a professor? And to ask of my students, what will you profess in order to be a media professional? And here I'm going to make confession, in the other and deeply religious sense of that word. I'm not a religious person, and I do not practice a faith, but I've had a past deeply embedded in Puritanism, a granny who was Christian Brethren, an induction into Anglicanism, and a foray into charismatic Christianity in my early 20s. This has shaped me, and in the years that I've walked away from and then looped back towards that shaping, I've become more generous and careful about throwing away some important learnings and insights just because I no longer want to live inside an orthodoxy. So when I use these two words, profession and confession, they are in a very serious sense intended to draw from the heart, from the root however uncomfortable, embarrassing, and compromised my route might be, to reach deep and to express in both word and action a commitment. So what do I think I profess? These are not just research interests or areas in which I've done some thinking and publishing. They happen to be areas of endeavour that matter very much to me, in that without acting in these spaces, I'm somewhat less of myself. I feel I'm not making much of a contribution to the profession I'm in or the world I live in. So there are three areas I'd like to discuss tonight. They are the personal and the political, talking and listening, and writing. So I'm going to turn to the first. I learnt as a baby journalist to be objective. I learnt that I could not know or say anything in my own voice. I learnt to find sources and quote them. I learnt to hold my tongue when a senior inside the newsroom, who hadn't actually been to the place where the story happened or talked to the people the story happened to, sat down and rearranged my copy in order to make it suit the voice the newspaper wanted to project or the attitude the newspaper wanted to strike. For years I was a staff reporter, but I shared newsrooms with people who had names on their stories, who had opinions, and who were allowed to say I. I aspired to be allowed to say I. But I learned pretty quickly there was a political economy in the right to say I. A tall, thin blonde, and some of you might remember her, with an attitude by the name of Janie Allen, was allowed by Sunday Times editor Tertius Myberg to say I. And the newspaper was invested in how she did it and what results it produced. It took a while for me to realize that this really wasn't about being tall and thin and blonde, because when it suited the newspaper, Janie Allen was summarily cast aside, and the consequences of that you can read about in her book, Janie Confidential. This made me cautious. I wasn't dead sure I wanted to embrace that kind of I position. Years later, on The Witness, I was packed off to cover a rape trial. And I found myself in a very dingy passageway outside a courtroom with a middle-aged grandmother and her three rapists waiting for a trial to start. The grandmother was distraught. I was aghast. The rapists were menacing. The trial began and was postponed immediately. She asked me to come to her home to see where the rape had taken place. She showed me her little house where she was babysitting her granddaughter. She showed me the street through the sitting room window where the three young men were revving a motorbike, and told me what happened when she went outside to ask them to be quiet for the sake of the sleeping child. When I got back to the newsroom, I was enraged by the callousness with which this woman was being treated by the police, the prosecutor, and the magistrate. I wanted to say some things that needed to be heard. I wanted her to be able to say I through our newspaper. A sub-editor shut down those intentions pretty fast by quoting the law to me. No opinion, no quotations from outside the courtroom while a trial was running. I've never forgotten how we failed that woman. I knew and believed in those prohibitions as critical to objective journalism, but I also knew we were complicit in her suffering. For a long time, I couldn't sort this out intellectually. It just seemed like a matter of ego, that as journalists, we all wanted to be recognized and respected for our work, but that those more senior, rightfully, had the power to determine when we had enough authority to be able to speak in our own voices and not embarrass the profession. And then there was that adage, we give voice to the voiceless, which was supposed to be the way we acted as surrogates and ventriloquists to enable women like that grandmother to be able to enter the public discourse. But neither of these two routes were working, and I couldn't do much at the time to change them. It was only when I was doing my doctoral study on Anthea Garman that I started to realize that I was drawn to someone who'd never had proper journalistic training, who'd spent a lifetime honing her ability to say and write I, and who'd nevertheless stepped into the leadership of the SABC radio coverage of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This line of thought had to be now pursued seriously, and it took me to Gillian Whitlock, who was studying the Australian Commission into the Aboriginal stolen children. Whitlock made the case that subaltern people have been denied voice and systematically not listened to in many societies across the world. And then when a formal commission allowed such people to speak for themselves and to say I and we in public, something really important had shifted in the political terrain. Because commissions must listen and because they must record, Hearing was taking place, in some cases for the very first time in Australia. An agency never allowed before was allowed into this space at a particular time. I applied this to Kroch's account of the TRC, Country of My Skull, where she was saying I, but in her book and radio reports she was also hosting testimonies from the Commission in which other people were saying I too, and she was using journalism to do it. Journalism had the flexibility to be able to manage these multiple I's, and as Whitlock pointed out, importantly, those listening were inhabiting the second-person position in this transaction and enabling others to take up the first person. Academia, too, has its struggles with the first person, and by extension with agency and authority. The prohibition for researchers and students on writing in first person is often still very much in place. The worry is that the personal emotional will get in the way of the construction of credible, authoritative knowledge, and this worry is directed most often at students. But we know knowledge is socially constructed. We know we make knowledge or preserve knowledge for particular purposes. We know that knowledge always comes out of a context and very often speaks back directly into that context. We know it's partial. We know it serves power. We know it has power. And the challenge of our decolonial times is to examine the ways in which we construct knowledge. One of the ways in which we take up the challenge is to look at who gets to say I, to ask whether those with power ever take up second-person position and allow themselves to be spoken to as you, and whether the subaltern in our society keep on being treated as they. We South Africans have an intimate knowledge of what deep wells of dispossession and disrespect the pronoun they conveys in our discussions. This thinking comes to me from Emile Benveniste, and for me now is not just about how I think about journalism and research, but also in ethics of being in the world. So I'm going to show you some of this lovely play between the I and you positions. I use I only when I am speaking to someone who will be a you in my address. It is this condition of dialogue that is constitutive of person, for it implies that reciprocally I becomes you in the address of the one who in his turn designates himself as an I. The male pronouns are all Emiles. Okay. Here we see a principle whose consequences are to spread out in all directions. I posits another person, the one who, being as he is, completely exterior to me, becomes my echo, to whom I say you and who says you to me. This polarity of persons is the fundamental condition of language, of which the process of communication in which we share is only a more pragmatic consequence. It is a polarity, moreover, very peculiar in itself, as it offers a type of opposition whose equivalent is encountered nowhere else outside of language. This polarity does not mean either equality or symmetry. Ego always has a position of transcendence with regard to you. Neither of the terms can be conceived of without the other. They are complementary, and so the old antinomies of I and the other, of the individual and society, fall. With the hot breath of the decolonial turn on my neck, I've started to think further about this I, you, they relationship. It's not just about voice, about the intellectual, the mind, and knowledge. It's also about lived experience, situated reality, and histories of dispossession. And so the further challenge is to embrace the other person not just as someone with agency who can step into I position, but also as a situated, embodied human being, or in the lovely portmanteau term Deborah Eicher-Cat uses, speaking, listening, body subject, which beautifully fleshes out the possibility we all have to be both first-person speaker and second-person listener and simultaneously embodied. And that brings me nicely to talking and listening. I discovered recently that Ariana Huffington had held a salon in her house for years before deciding to start the media company that we now know as the Huff Post. And for me, the best bits of Habermas's structural transformation of the public sphere and inquiry into a category of bourgeois society are all about the salons run by women and the gatherings in 18th century coffee shops. I suppose if you start life as a very chatty 3-year-old, it might not be surprising that you are attracted to talking as a research subject. Talking was a big deal in my family. We talked over food at the dining room table. We spent Sunday afternoons under trees at my grandfather's house talking. We invited people over from other tables in restaurants to continue very interesting conversations. I can't tell you how many conversations with strangers I had when I was a child. As a teenager, I would rather have spent 4 hours talking than dancing or watching a movie. Only reading a book could compete. The talking I was party to in the 1980s, when South Africa was convulsively in the last stages of apartheid, changed my life, my attitudes, and my commitments. So I was delighted to hear Deborah Posel say in 2004 at a symposium on 10 years of South African democracy that democracies are very talkative. Posel had been studying talk radio, which was thriving in the early years of the new democracy, and she was curious as to what this airway of openness was allowing people to say. A high number of the conversations she was monitoring were about sex, she reported. This is not surprising, because people were coming out of 40 years of the apartheid regime's widespread social controls. But given the possibility to be political, South Africans also had other issues on their minds. As I walked into my PhD, which was centered in a group studying South African intellectual life and the post-apartheid public sphere, I was strongly cautioned to assume that being political was the only large concern South Africans were going to express in public. Habermas's neat study, in which he moved from a rich description of the 18th century spaces of talk in England, Germany, and France, to a normative and prescriptive set of ideals about what topics and how people in democracies should be behaving in order to have healthy public spheres, had to be set aside in order to ask just what was actually going on. This chaos and noise, which is most often mediated through talk radio, newspaper columns, literary festivals, etc., 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 gripped me and has never stopped being very interesting to me. When I first came to Grahamstown, I found that the section of the National Arts Festival that interested me most was the Winter School. The array of expert speakers talking on a wide range of topics and the possibility of the question and answer session afterwards were fascinating. You could hear people from all over the country, sometimes the world, express themselves and their thoughts and their lives. In 2008, when the festival no longer had a convener for the Winter School, I plucked up the courage to tell Lynette Marais, the festival director at the time, that I really wanted that job. I so wanted to be able to put the conversations out there in public, to craft the subject matter, to call a range of experts to Grahamstown to spark the talking. When Ismail Mohammed took over as director the next year, he decided the name was too chilly and remote, and so he convened a group to brainstorm a new name, and ThinkFest came into being. I liked the idea of thinking and talking being so powerfully linked. So in the language of the previous section, this was all about taking up the I position and using it. But as I convened and managed these gatherings, some of which became extremely fractious and full of expressions of anger and hurt, particularly in the last 3 years as the student protests swept our country, I got more and more interested in the how of convening, the making of a space not just for speaking, but also for listening, paying attention, learning and changing one's mind, inhabiting you position. I started to ask whether those who came into the ThinkFest space, assured of their power, were able to inhabit the second-person position. In one of these discussions, titled, "What Should White People Be Thinking, Saying, Doing Now?" I specifically asked the audience to allow the young, the female, and those who were black to speak first in their groups. Despite this, I could see older white men doing most of the talking and dispensing of their particular brand of wisdom. And that's a photograph from that particular event. Okay. From 2011 to 2016, Herman Wasserman and I had Mellon money and then NRF money to run a research project into media and citizenship. We had a very important encounter at the IAMCR, you can ask me what it means afterwards, it's a conference, in Durban in 2012 with Australian researchers who we have come to know as the Listening Project. And they introduced us to a host of researchers who have new ways of thinking about democracy, citizenship, agency, taking up rights, and voice. Thinkers like Tanya Dreyer, Kate Lacey, Elizabeth Lapari, Nick Couldry, and Susan Bickford on the right address the persistent inequities and shortcomings of democratic states and their public spheres by taking issue with the core idea of democratic theory and public sphere common wisdom, that protection of voice is the crucial component in securing freedom, choice, agency, and as a check on unbridled power. In dealing with entrenched poverty, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, misogyny, and the cultural annihilation of indigenous groups, these theorists ask whether the listening intention is more important in the workings of democracy and public deliberation than the much vaunted, highly prized, and protected expression of voice. Kate Lacey in particular takes issue with the idea that listening is essentially a passive exercise and therefore not suited to the active world of politics. She says, listening is at the heart of what it means to be in the world, to be active, to be political. Listening tends to be taken for granted, a natural mode of reception that is more passive than active. But listening is a critical category that ought to be right at the heart of any consideration of public life. Lacey also looks at the over-attention given to the idea of voice and argues that by contrast, the presence of a listening public is simply assumed. No special freedoms or protections are afforded to the act of listening. The figure of the listener is a shadowy one in political theory, she says. Lacey is a former radio journalist, and she leans on her knowledge of sound and language to emphasize that because the modern public sphere was historically rooted in the development of print culture, capitalism, nationalism, and the Enlightenment, in which the public was constituted as a reading public, the consequence is that speaking has been treated in law as a property attached to an individual, and therefore the only right in this equation which can be defended and protected. The inability to concretize listening and pin it down in law means that a very important facet of its value for public life, sociality and understanding, is diminished. Lacey says listening is concerned precisely with guaranteeing the context within freedom of expression can operate as communication. Elizabeth Lapari goes somewhat further by stretching listening into what she calls attunement, taking a word from Heidegger. She describes attunement as standing with you, right next to you, belonging to you, fully present to the ongoing expression of you, letting go of my ideas about who you are, who I am, what should be. I let all that go, and I stay present, attending, aware. This introduces a psychological and even spiritual dimension into understandings of speaking in the public sphere. Lapari's work draws on Jewish spirituality. And such an approach does demand, in the moment, an abandonment of the goals, often, of public debate, which is usually to reach some sort of consensus or decision-making. This attitude, which Lapari also calls hosting, is more than just paying attention to words and arguments, but also to where the words come from, who embodies them, and out of which subjectivities and contexts they speak. And so to writing, or the confession part. When I worked on my master's degree, I did what many, many students do: read, amass material, talk, especially to my supervisor and at symposia where we presented our work, and avoid writing until the deadline loomed so hard and menacingly that it could no longer be avoided. I took 6 weeks off work to write the thesis, and on the very first day I'd written all I knew and wanted to say within 3 pages. I phoned Brian in tears. I was still working as a journalist and had never in journalism written anything longer than about 1,000 words. I still didn't really know how to go long and deep. These were the days before MA theses were buttoned into a suit which had 5 slick chapters: context, theoretical framework, methodology, findings and discussion, and conclusion. I don't know what the scientists do. I can only speak for us arts people. Okay. I was on my own to find a form, and it was very hard indeed. So coming to Rhodes, one of the things to learn and make my own was academic writing, going long, sustaining an argument. For a number of years, I kept on writing journalism, and in keeping with the more serious me, I had given up poetry or anything creative. I battled my way through the doctorate writing, again, trying very hard not to write until I'd sorted out entirely what I had in my head. Tawana Coupe, then at Wits and a former Rhodes colleague, told me one day at the beginning of the process to start writing and not stop. It was advice too terrifying to take. But I did, again with deadlines pushing, write the thing. But as with the MA, I fought with the I position, which came naturally and which I wanted, but was terrified to take up. In 2014, our research group invited Pamela Nichols from the Wits Writing Centre to run a writing retreat for us. The group was under pressure to publish, and we needed some inspiration. After a one-day encounter, we all agreed we needed to go away for at least 4 full days with Pamela and do this really properly. In a cold and rainy Hogsback farmhouse, Pamela used poetry, lists, serious academic texts, and a variety of other forms to get us to write. For the first 3 days, despite having brought along a paper that needed to be smacked into shape, I just couldn't work. On the free afternoons, when everyone else found a corner to work in or walked to clear their thoughts, I crawled into bed and slept. On the 4th morning, I woke bright as a bell with 3 poems in my head, which had to be committed to paper immediately. That was a surprise. But the largest surprise was how, when we returned home to our hectic lives, the paper just sort of wrote itself into something logical. I realized that to separate the genres and pretend that different parts of my mind could best keep them in compartments was just crazy. I also realized that because early desires to be a creative writer had never come to fruition, that the logical left brain part of me, or the predatory brain in Oliver Sacks's terms, had decided to jettison the pleasure and play of creative writing for the functionality and importance of first journalism and then research writing. I tentatively started to become an advocate of writing in all forms, all genres, and of pre-writing and free writing and loop writing and anything else interesting I could lay my hands on that challenged logocentric writing, believing with Pamela that, of course, it would bleed and leak and have effects. I read Eat, Pray, Love, and I enjoyed it. I thought... Okay. I thought Elizabeth Gilbert an interesting confessional writer, but a little bit lightweight. Then I was drawn to her later book, The Signature of All Things. It was research-heavy and very beautifully written, with a strange, quirky female character, love gone wrong, various obsessions, fluid sexuality, misunderstood commitments, and it was set in colonial collecting times when the desire to know the whole world was first paramount. I changed my mind about Elizabeth Gilbert. Then she produced Big Magic, her book about the necessity for everyone to be creative, about a birthright no one should be able to take away from you or for you to be able to talk yourself out of. It was a big challenge for me, and for the first time, even though I have actually more or less made every cent I have ever earned my whole working career, primarily from writing, I was able to say out loud and clear, I am a writer. It's a bit different from I am an alcoholic. It's a bit more positive, okay. But it takes the same degree of courage, okay. And like all new converts, I believe everyone can write and everyone should write. I believe writing should be full of fun and enjoyment and be both low stakes and high stakes, silly and serious. I also believe art and creativity are for everyone, and that it is the fault of education, the system, and our stupid desire for professionalism or nothing that these precious things are taken away from us. How did we come to believe that if you could not show yourself to be a very talented ballet dancer, flute player, oil painter from an early age, and you could not demonstrate your commitment via the hours every day demanded to achieve the highest standards, that you should give it up entirely and make way for those who could? How did the space become so narrow that pure enjoyment in a pursuit was squeezed out entirely? Why are we so intolerant of the mediocre, the amateur, the dabblings? In addition to Pamela and Liz, I've had my mind rearranged by Athena Vala and Francois van Eck, 2 dance teachers who utterly believe in making dance training available to those who will never be professional, but for whom it brings great joy as well as challenge and stimulation. Brilliance in a pursuit should not at all be threatened by good enough and just mucking around, and both should make space for the other. Why am I saying this? Because almost every day of my teaching life, I have students tell me I can't write. Undergraduates doing the writing and editing specialization, and postgraduates doing their own self-initiated studies. I also have colleagues tell me they can't write. What do they mean by I can't write and they can't write? I think the students mean often, I write a lot, I love poetry, I have a blog, I'm busy on social media, But what I find difficult and terrifying is academic genre. And because it's so terribly high stakes, I defer any attempt to write until a deadline forces me to. What my colleagues mean is not that our students literally cannot write. They write in ways we don't find acceptable. They haven't mastered genre, conventions, voice, tone, address, and authority. I'm lucky this year to be responsible for the academic writing course which accompanies our postgraduate coursework program. This has meant I've been able to immerse myself in that whole research world of research writing and to learn a lot about its parameters and its core philosophies. And I'm happy to report the congruence between the proponents of creative writing and the proponents of academic writing. My own hero in this way of thinking is the extraordinary Laurel Richardson, who wrote the chapter on writing for the Denson and Lincoln Handbook on Qualitative Research. Her chapter, Writing, a Method of Inquiry, on page 923, looking at all the students in the audience, makes the fairly radical claim, radical because I'd not heard anybody say this before she did to me, that writing is research. It isn't just the necessary bit you do to pull the research together. It isn't the packaging after the questions are all asked and the answers all sewn up. It's the very engine of the process, the means, the way to figure things out, the mechanism to understand how you, the researcher / sense maker, and the material you're working with relate to each other. That idea rearranged my head in terms of doing research, but it also rearranged my thoughts about how to carve out an academic identity for myself by putting at the core of what I do my commitment to writing as a creative, useful, valuable activity of discovery and communication. For years I survived just on that one chapter and strangely enough didn't go looking for more of Laurel. But just recently I've discovered that she's put her own thoughts about carving out her own career on paper in the book Fields of Play, Constructing an Academic Life. Richardson interweaves the personal and the sociological in this account of her experimentations and begins by telling us on page 1 that she's applying the sociological imagination to the act of writing. She asks, how do the specific circumstances in which we write affect what we write? How does what we write affect who we become? Her text is constructed through a process she calls pleating, an interplay of essays and papers and writing backstories about their production. I love the backstory about how something came into being, and especially about the final product of research, which is often presented as a newborn without a flaw. Richardson says she's also looking into her claims to knowledge, her sense of self within her discipline's politics, the constraints that have caged her in, and the longings that has induced. And I resonate with that sense of longings. The book is fascinating, but also wades into tricky territory. Particularly interesting are the experiments in delivering and communicating knowledge she embarks on. For instance, she presented a series of research interviews as a set of poems in the first person, allowing her interviewees to speak the truth of their own lives in an elegiac way. My favorite, and I'm still amazed that she had the courage to do this, is the call and response session in which she involved conference participants instead of delivering a paper and taking questions. So she actually dished out to the audience their response, and then she performed it. It's a really lovely thing. Okay. Richardson shows me processes and choices that are often totally opaque in the published, delivered work of most theorists and researchers, and she helps me figure out a way to be a researcher with a core identity as a writer. I also want to mention two sort of autobiographies that gave me insight into how the personal became the life work and the theory making. They are Mahmoud Mamdani's From Citizen to Refugee and Pierre Bourdieu's Sketch for a Self-Analysis. Mamdani's book was written while he was in a transit refugee housing in London in 1973. His family, along with other Asians, had been thrown out of Uganda even though they all had citizenship. In the 2011 preface, he reflects on how he began to theorize from this experience and how this set him on a life trajectory to formulate powerful and useful ideas about citizens and subjects in post-colonial African governments. Bourdieu's book, which he says firmly is not an autobiography, is about how the French son of the village postmaster who did military service in Algeria carved a place for himself in the academy, which drew on the commitments he had made for his life. So this is a bit of confession. It's pretty, this isn't working. I would like to, great, it's working, wonderful. All right, so you can quickly look at that. Oh, you must read this. I put this in for your delectation. And I'll have a glass of water while you do. Okay, I'm glad you've enjoyed it, because it was meant to do that. Okay, so there's Laurel Richardson with her lovely books, and there's both Mum Daddy. Now, you can't see that picture there terribly carefully, but it relates to this next confession. The only pilgrimage I have ever made to a grave was to Pierre Bourdieu's, and that was because Guy Berger, recognizing that I should do that, took me there. So I've got to tell you something about what touches me about this grave. Can you see how simple it is? Pierre Bourdieu, and I can't read the dates, but something in the 30s, tiny little hyphen to the date of death. That little hyphen is the life. That tiny little mark, that is the life of that man. It so touches me to think that somebody with a vast, vast life puts it in such simple terms at their death. Anyway, let me stop, otherwise I'm going to cry. Okay. More theorists should write about the genesis of their theory, the connectedness with their own life experiences, the stories of how these two modes of being work together. Okay, so anybody who's been in our building will know where this comes from. The disabled toilet on the second floor. Okay. So this takes me back to the beginning and to the first person political and an ending of sorts. When I was doing my PhD, one of the doctoral students in my research program said to me one day she was uncomfortable with the kind of academic she felt she was being forced to become. It was a novel thought. I had not stopped to consider that along with the reading, writing, and discussing was also an identity formation program. Since then, I've been way more attentive to this idea of an academic identity and how the choices you have to keep on making, get involved in this research group, put this article into that journal, collaborate with that person, supervise that student, shape this identity. In my early days at Rhodes, my then writing and editing colleague Kathy Knox likened my approach to my work as building a Byzantine cathedral and pleaded with me to make whatever the task at hand was very much simpler. That accusation shocked me but delighted me at the same time, and has never left me as a way to describe what I want to create as an academic. I don't really want my life's work to be the ploughing of a single seam which solidly piles up as a body or a corpus. I greatly admire people who do that, and thank goodness for them, because they enable the rest of us to teach with coherence. But I'm not one of those people. I would like to create a cathedral of light and shadow, corners to explore, and crazy saints to adore with dripping candles and secret passages under the terrazzo. It's to the credit of this institution, my school, my various heads of department, my colleagues, especially in the writing and editing cluster, my dear, close and absent women friends, my writing group, my very precious students, my doctoral supervisor and cohort, my collaborators, my fellow researchers in the pursuits that matter to me, my old family, my nuclear family, and my recently acquired new family, that I have been enabled to pursue this quirky route with its bends and detours. So thank you.
Professor Garman, Anthea, that's the first time I've ever called you Professor Garman. Okay, but no, this is the right occasion to do it. Thank you so much for that fascinating and revealing talk. What a splendid accident, or series of accidents.
It feels like it.
I'd also like to point out that obviously the school's been important to you. I can see why. I mean, the sophistication of the lavatory graffiti written by G. Deleuze. I mean, it really does say something. But congratulations on this very worthy promotion. Here's a small token of appreciation. I actually don't know what it is, but you're very welcome to it.